Hi, my name is Sissi Jian and I'm a junior majoring in CSE. And today I'm going to introduce a useful web design tool called the RESTful API. So the goal of this presentation is to give a brief introduction of what the concept of REST and how RESTful API is used in web design. So first, we're going to discuss what RESTful API is. Second, we're going to give a couple examples of how RESTful API is used in practice. Third, we're going to discuss the advantages of using RESTful APIs in web design. And then we're going to touch on a few disadvantages of using RESTful APIs and provide some alternative styles of APIs. And lastly, I will give a summary marked down some key points about RESTful API that I hope you can take away from this presentation. So before we dive into what RESTful API is, let's first discuss what REST stands for. So REST stands for Representation State Transfer, which is a term defined by Rowe Fielding in 2000. There are two key components in REST. First is resources, which is the data in any format defined by Uniform Resource Identifier, which is commonly referred to as URI. And a well-known example of URI is URL, which we see almost daily. As you can see, the acronym of URI and URL is very similar, but they does not mean the same thing. Actually, URL is a subset of URI. The second component of REST is resource method, which is commonly referred to as put, delete, post, and get, the basic four method used in HTTP. However, we have to note here that REST does not equal to HTTP. Rather, REST is a concept that is most commonly practiced under the context of HTTP. So conceptually, REST is an architectural style for providing standards between computer systems on the web. As shown in the figure below, we have client on one side and server on the other side. REST is serving as a bridge connecting the client and the server. The resource method is like the cars traveling on the bridge, and the resources and URI are like the goods carried on the car, transferred between the client and the server. So then, what is API? API stands for refer to Application Programming Interface. So conceptually, API is very similar to ADT, which we have learned in Principle of Software. The information that API could provide is like the object of ADT. The set of rules that the client should follow to get information from the API are like the operations of the ADT. And the key benefit of using APIs are abstraction, separation, and flexibility. As we can see from the figure below, the API is serving as a barrier separating the server side and the client side. So the API hides away the implementation detail, the database, and the business logic from the various clients. And as you can see from the figure that various clients can interact with API as long as they follow the appropriate request format. So, what is RESTful API? By defining REST and API, we get a better understanding. So basically, RESTful API is the application programming interface that emphasizes the REST architecture. So more specifically, it is APIs that follows the 6 constraints of REST. First, the uniform interface means that the client have to communicate with the RESTful API in a uniform way. The second is client-server separation. That means the RESTful API should hide away implementation details of the server from the client. stateless means that the client have to provide all the information needed for the RESTful API to return appropriate information. So, such as username and cookies have to be provided by the client, not stored on the API. And layer systems stand from client-server separation. As the API hides away details, we have more freedom of how we develop the server side. And cacheable means that the RESTful API can utilize the HTTP cache so that the client does not have to make redundant requests on data that have not been updated since last access. And finally is the optional constraint of code on demand. So the client can request for code from the RESTful API so that RESTful API returns a script that the client can run on. That means the client has less requirement on pre-installation of any script because it can rely on the RESTful API to provide it. So let's dive into a couple examples of RESTful APIs in practice. So the first example is a notebook API written in Python using the Flex modular. Our client is a web browser, and our server is the localhost on port 5000. As you can see here, I have already run the Python code on the localhost server on port 5000, and it is waiting for a request from the client. And the request is in format of URL and a JSON, and our API should return rendered HTML templates. So you can see here we have the user. You can see here the service is hosted on the port on the local host with port 5000, and then you can see we are listening on HTTP endpoint here, and with the post method. So you can post new information to the RESTful API using the post. Using the post method, you can see the newly updated data is here. And then with the post method, the API gets information in JSON format, and it will then store it into its data structure and return the rendered HTML back to the client so the client see the update on the display. And you can also delete contents from the display from the notebook as the client calls this delete method, calls this delete from the RESTful API here. The client provides the username and the index number of the information that they want to delete, and then the RESTful API get that information and delete from the data structure accordingly. So you can see that the client side, on the client side, is a good abstraction. The delete and submit the form is a good abstraction of what is actually going on the back end. It's a good abstraction of a notebook. The dirty works are all happening on the back end of the RESTful API, and it is hidden away from the client side. And the client actually get to send the session so that the API could return the appropriate information according to which state which user it is the client is currently working under. And the second in the second example, the RESTful API is the client of the RESTful API is another web application called Node-RED. So in this case, the Node-RED prepare the information in this node in JSON format, and it gets passed into the API. The passed in JSON data is highlighted in red, and the URL and the method of the RESTful API is highlighted in yellow in the code. And then after this black box function called heal sort, the API will get a list of sorted recipes, and it will dump into JSON format because we have defined on the client side that the return is going to be a JSON object. After it dumps into the JSON format, it gets returned back to the Node-RED flow. So the benefit of the RESTful API is that it is less platform dependent, as we've seen in the previous examples, that the client can be a web browser or it can be another web application. And it provides decoupling of UI implementation and data processing, as I think it's really conceptually similar to the model view controller pattern. The client is like the view and the RESTful API is like the model. And it provides good abstraction of representation and operations. And it provides extreme scalability, as you have the server side have the freedom to scale up its functionality without affecting the client, as long as the API preconditions and post-conditions is held. So the RESTful API provides a scalable, low coupling, and low custom design solution to integrate in our web design. Now let's discuss some of the cons of the RESTful API. The RESTful API tends to involve asynchronous programming, as the API have to wait for the clients to send in request, and the client have to wait for the API to return. So if it's really computationally heavy on the API side, that means the client have to wait for a long time, which is not very good in a web design. And also, RESTful API is heavily dependent on internet connectivity and availability of the RESTful API service. If by accident the RESTful API have a bad connection, the client side will just end up with a non-responsive system, which is also not what we want. There are some alternatives to the RESTful API, such as the SOAP API, which has a strong documentation and strict regulation. The GraphQL API is based on a tree data model, which makes it really efficient in data extraction. And JSON Pure API is easy to debug because its payload have a domain-specific vocabulary, which means it's more human-readable. And in summary, if your project utilizes HTTP, require a great flexibility and high scalability, and you want it to be simple and quick to implement, RESTful API is your good choice and good friend in your web design. And in conclusion, the key takeaway point about the RESTful API will be that it will really benefit your web design in terms of abstraction and low coupling. If you're interested to know more about RESTful API or API architecture in general, here are some books that you can. I would recommend you to look into. And finally, these are the references that I used for this presentation. Thank you.